everyone, we'll just give it a few moments for everyone to connect this afternoon. Hope everyone's well. Give it a few more seconds just to get everyone to connect on, and then I'll dive in. Okay, let's start. So hi everyone, and welcome to IAB Europe's final Industry Insider of 2021 with Oracle Advertising. Very delighted to have you all joining us live today. My name is Lauren Wakefield. I'm the Marketing and Industry Programs Director at IAB Europe. And for those of you that perhaps aren't familiar with our Industry Insiders, it's really just an opportunity to get expert advice, examples and insights from those in the know, so our IAB Europe members. We've covered an array of topics throughout this year, including things like curated marketplaces with Xandr. We've looked at CTV research with Magnite, and most recently covered the e-commerce landscape with Meta. But we're very excited to introduce today's session with Oracle Advertising, as they look to unpack the fascinating channel that is audio through measurement and context. Today, we'll be hearing from Moomal and Mark from Oracle Advertising, as well as Faye McDowall from Global DAX, as they break down the state of audio today and the measurement and contextual solutions at your fingertips that can help inform your decisions of tomorrow. We've got a really great agenda coming up to feature all of this in the next hour. But just before I hand over to Moomal to kind of kick everything off, just a little bit of housekeeping. So you will be able to see that there is on the interface at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box. So if you do have any questions for any of today's speakers, do pop them in there, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end of the session. As with all of our events, this is live, so we really do encourage you to post any questions that you have. We are also recording this session, so we'll be able to share a copy of the recording with you afterwards if there's anything you kind of want to go back over and dive back into. But with that, Moomal, I'll hand the screen and the floor over to you.
Awesome. Let me pull this up. Great. Well, thanks so much, Lauren, for that introduction, and welcome to everyone who's joining us wherever in the world you may be. I am Moomal Shaikh. I am a senior product manager at Oracle Advertising. I work on all things audio at Oracle Moat, and I also work on a few other publisher solutions. So today I'm very excited to be here to help unpack digital audio through the lens of measurement and context. And we hope to be able to do that in a way where everyone can walk away having some valuable information they're taking with them. So there's really no denying that audio context consumption has greatly shifted to an audio model. So when we think about consumption of content, audio seems to be becoming a major avenue for that. And if we think about just a simple experiment for the audience, how often in your day you're using your headphones or your smart speakers in your homes, how often you're using your AirPods. Or as an alternative, if you ask someone what their preferred music streaming apps are, there's often strong opinions that come along with that. But these are ultimately very strong indicators that the audio ecosystem is not only here to stay, but it's actually growing at a very fast pace as well. So with that, it's really not going to be that surprising to see some of these stats in here. According to Statista, earlier in Q1 of 2021, they found that the number of music streaming subscribers worldwide was about 487 million. Now, what's important to keep in mind here is that these are actually paid music streaming subscribers. And that seems to be the norm for these music fans. And it's consistently growing. In fact, if you look at numbers over the last few years, it's consistently impressive to see that number increase, which is why it's also no surprise that there's over 380 million podcast listeners worldwide. The second stat is actually from a study that was done by eMarketer earlier this year in, I believe, July 2021. They essentially looked at 18 different countries, 10 of those which were from Europe, And they found that, and of course, using estimates from surveys and a number of different things that went into their methodology. But ultimately, the point of this is that this audio content consumption is consistently growing. And it's a pretty impressive trajectory towards how we are choosing to consume content today. Now, when we think about why that's happening, we think that this shift to audio listening behavior has to do with a few different things that we've chosen to highlight. Of course, this can be expanded as well. But some of the reasons include things like an increase in user behavior around smart speakers and using AirPods and headphones. It's almost like your AirPods have become almost a wearable device as well. So anywhere that you're going, you tend to take your headphones or your AirPods with you. In your homes, you may have multiple smart speakers as well. So with that, of course, you start to think about the second reason, which is that we really do live a very on-the-go lifestyle. Even during the pandemic, people were spending more time outside, going on road trips, camping, and going on hikes became a much bigger trend as well. And fitness outdoors became a big trend. So that actually came down to the fact that you did want to have your music with you. You still wanted to consume content, but you just didn't want to do it in front of the screen. That ultimately brings us to the next reason we think audio consumption has grown over the last couple of years, over the last several years actually, but more so the couple of years. We generally tend to have screen fatigue. So thinking about the pandemic itself, everyone sits on their computers all day and then goes and watch TV, and then you have another screen where you're looking at your phone. There's actually stats around pandemic eye strain, which are very, very real. That ultimately brings us to our last point, as well as to why consumer behavior has shifted to a more audio-focused model. This one's very interesting to think about when we consider the trust deficit that many consumers have in what they read online. It's really interesting, mostly because those same consumers who may not trust that particular publisher's content, yet seem to have a lot of loyalty and trust in the same publisher's podcast, but mostly to the podcast hosts themselves. This not only goes to show the intimacy of the audio medium, but just how we concentrate and how we choose to consume that content actually comes with a lot more than just listening. It's a much more intimate platform. So we tend to have more loyalty and more concentration in that environment as well. Of course, as you have consumers shift to more audio-focused models, brands are consistently trying to find ways to reach their audiences. And according to Statista, audio actually took up about 1.6% of the total digital ad spend in Europe in 2020, and that amounted to $1.2 billion. And of course, then we had some more research, and this is according to Data Access, where the total podcast ad revenue in Europe was about $75 million. What I want to point out over here, while I wasn't able to find very reliable stats to show the comparison here, I do want to share a little bit of context from what we see in the US as well. And essentially what that's been is that despite seeing similar audience volume in the US and Europe, the monetization has been more sophisticated and more advanced in the US than it has been in Europe. And we think some of the reasons may be because of the diversity of local languages, which has created scalability issues as well. We think that it may also have to do with the diversity of content not being as vast, given that there's so many different languages to cater to as well. Now, the beauty of digital advertising is that that same investment that goes into the audio medium allows for the sustenance of that ecosystem. So in order to sustain the ecosystem of storytelling and journalism within the audio medium, those investments made from the standpoint of media dollars not only allow for better and more evolved content, but it also allows for much better technology. It allows for much better, more mindful and thoughtful targeting mechanisms, and just an overall better experience for consumers as well, which is why ultimately we're very excited about the prospect for audio to continue growing. Now, with that, what we also want to be sure to acknowledge are the different challenges that the audio ecosystem faces. This certainly doesn't cover the entire scope of the challenges, but we did choose to highlight three primary ones that we think are pretty important for everyone to know. We'll start off with the lack of transparency. Now, what we covered earlier around the increase and like the impressive numbers in terms of ad spending within the audio ecosystem, that's great. And it's consistently growing, but there seems to be an apprehension in wanting to invest more heavily. And to kind of put that into context, anyone who may be listening from a brand or agency, you know, most folks will have a favorite podcast. You know that most folks are listening to music streaming platforms. Yet there's this hesitation to invest more because there isn't that level of transparency to really know what's going on during the life of the campaign itself. While you have brand studies and attribution studies that are definitely powerful in providing insight into the success of the campaign, being able to make optimizations during the life of the campaign itself is an incredibly powerful tool, which is only possible if we create those modes of transparency into that experience itself. The second challenge that we want to highlight is the technical silos. There might be a better way to phrase this itself, but essentially it is ultimately the challenge that we're dealing with. The audio ecosystem has been built with so many different pipes that don't necessarily talk to each other, and they're not very well connected. Now, this is a challenge because it is something we're all working on as a collective ecosystem to make sure that we can find ways to create that path that allows for things like transparency, allows for things like more mindful targeting, allows for discoverability, all of these different things where all these pieces play better together so that the overall ecosystem can evolve and we can continue creating better content and better experiences for our audiences. And that brings us to the third challenge. So there are certain concerns around how audience targeting is done. And while there is a lot of sophistication and it is pretty cool, we want to be really mindful so that we don't ultimately end up hurting that ecosystem. We've done a lot of cool and very sophisticated things in display and video, but I think we can all admit that there was a compromise in the user experience online. So while we continue to expand what we can do within an audio environment, we also want to be mindful to protect that environment and take learnings from what happened in display and video, and be sure to provide a good consumer experience as you continue to evolve the ecosystem itself. So we're going to go ahead and start with digging into some of these challenges. When we talk about the lack of transparency, really what we're thinking is that brands ultimately want to know some basic questions. Was my ad delivered? Was it delivered to a human endpoint? Did my ad actually play during that stream of content? Was the sound on while it was playing? Did someone hear my ad for at least 2 continuous seconds? And when you think about this particular question, you can start to think about things like sonic identity of a brand. It often takes, according to actually research done by Pandora, along with a university they partnered with in California, they found that it takes human beings about 2 seconds to recognize sonic identity. So I won't necessarily hum the tunes right now, but if you want to think about some sonic identity examples, I would encourage you to think about McDonald's or Nokia or Intel or Microsoft or even Netflix, which has been a very integral part of our pandemic lifestyle. But all of those sounds are very recognizable. And there's actually a science that goes behind why those sounds specifically are chosen for those particular brands. A few other questions to consider. Did someone listen to my ad until the first quartile? How about halfway through? Did they complete the entire ad? And this is really important as you start to think as a brand and agency about the kind of creatives that are being served and the where that sonic identity or that core brand message ultimately may be. You want to be able to answer questions like, was my ad surrounded by content that actually provided a positive experience for my brand? Did it complement it in a positive way? And then of course you continue asking those questions as you go further. Did it drive my campaign KPIs? Was it brand awareness, driving sales, increasing visits, whatever it may be? So ultimately what we come down to is having that level of measurement conducted by an unbiased third-party measurement vendor who has nothing to do with the media buy, so that you're not ultimately grading your own homework. So at Mo, we look at things like, was the impression served, so impressions analyzed? Was the sound on? Was the sound on at the first, second, third quartile? This is actually really interesting information because it can be indicative of any kind of muting behavior or skipping behavior if that format is available. What's also neat about the quartiles is you finally have a little bit of insight into that creative optimization that needs to be made. So you can start to think, if people generally tend to mute this ad at the second quartile or the third quartile, but my primary message or my call to action is ultimately right at the end, maybe I need to do some creative optimizations. Maybe a 15 or 30-second ad slot isn't the right format for an audio environment. You finally have the ability to do that level of A/B testing where you can make better decisions on how to reach your audiences in the most mindful yet effective ways. In the US, we have the MRC audible rate, which is essentially the standard of audibility. This is the 2 continuous seconds within an audio ad to better understand whether the opportunity to hear and notice and give attention to that creative was provided by the media partner. This may expand and evolve over time, but at this point in time, this seems to be the foundational aspect from where you can expand further into things like quartiles, how long the ad was, and drilling further and further into a more granular set of data. Now, what's also really important is making sure that your ads are being delivered to a human endpoint. So as quickly as consumers are shifting to an audio model, you know that advertisers are following closely behind. And without doubt, you have your ad fraudsters following too. So it's really important to be able to understand that ecosystem. But what we want to make sure we don't lose sight of is that you can't just copy paste what you're doing within display and video into an audio environment. And the reason for that is because we have certain nuances in audio that have to be taken into consideration. There is no visual component to an audio ad. And historically, traditionally, I guess, we've considered invalid traffic or digital invalid traffic in these environments to have some sort of relatability to that viewability component or that visual aspect itself. And of course, as we go further into the ad experience too, knowing the contextual intelligence that surrounds the ad itself is incredibly important at providing better experiences to our audiences and continue to grow the environment. I do want to spend a quick few minutes on taking a deeper dive into invalid traffic within the audio ecosystem. So we, of course, have the overall invalid traffic as per the MRC, which requires general invalid traffic, which is more list-based activity. So you can think of known IPs or known data centers. You know these are non-human endpoints. When you think about the IAB ABC list of bots and spiders, the Google bot, this is not necessarily malicious, but it's certainly not a human endpoint and not where you want majority of your ads to be going. Sophisticated invalid traffic is, of course, a little bit more intentional when someone is intentionally trying to dupe the system. So while measurement from display and video has certainly been applied to audio, some of the nuances that we're really researching with our data science teams, and this is very fascinating to me, is things like hidden ad rate. So hidden ad rate, a lot of times for audio, this gets flagged because just of the nature of how those audio ads are created. We think about things like session hijacked. And this is actually a really cool one as well, because one of the components that would go into it is things like when your phone is locked, it's on charge, and your content is running. And that would be malicious if you think about a display or video ad where you have a visual component to it. But when we think about audio, that's just the nature of listening to audio. It lives in a backgrounded tab. Your phone is most likely on charge, and it's pretty likely that it's also in a lock screen. So we want to be sure to be very mindful and thoughtful about how we're thinking about the audio environment, so we don't ultimately end up misclassifying impressions as invalid traffic and hurt that ecosystem. Because every time the publisher is hurt in that ecosystem, or we take away that level of monetization without being careful around accuracy and reliability of data, ultimately as consumers, we all suffer because content creation essentially gets hurt as well. Now, that same level of IVT that we just chatted through can also be used for better understanding streaming fraud. So things like spin fraud, royalty diversion, artist spoofing. Are there any indicators within that same measurement across the ad experience that could provide additional information or intel around streaming fraud as well? So it's incredibly interesting to see what all can be done from a transparency perspective and how much that unlocks for all players of the ecosystem to better to better move forward in driving forward audio as well. Now let's go into the next challenge, which is technical silos. The way we think about digital audio at Oracle Moat is essentially we break it out between music streaming and podcasting. And now music streaming itself is also further broken out when we think about the integrations. It has to do with ad delivery, how ads are served, and who is essentially in charge of reading certain kinds of material within the ad and stream itself. So you can think about client-side ad insertion. You also think about server-side ad insertion. So these are the two ways that ad delivery takes place within music streaming. In podcasting, it's all server-side ad insertion, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on what exactly this means in just a second. But within podcasting, we also have to take into account further nuances, which make it slightly a bit more challenging, but again, another opportunity for the whole industry to collaborate and figure out next steps. So what is client-side ad insertion? Essentially what client-side ad insertion is that your content stream, whether it's music or any other kind of content, is independent of the ad itself. So it's essentially running separately. You can switch between the two, and the client-side app, which is the end user app, essentially knows when one starts and the other ends. So from a measurement perspective as well, it's fairly easy to know how to measure that too. And they essentially run separately. It's a very traditional relationship with an ad server too. You have your content running, it stops, it calls an ad, the ad runs, and then your content starts up again. Now, server-side ad insertion is when the ad is actually stitched into the stream. While this does provide better playback, there are some challenges, again, that have to be addressed, which would essentially be things like the end user app trying to figure out when does the content end and the ad start, because it essentially comes as one full stream. There's certainly different players in the ecosystem who've been building some pretty cool stuff around better understanding this ecosystem, but it is important to take this baseline information forward as we start to think about all the different kinds of integrations. Now for podcasting, all of the ad delivery is server-side ad inserted, which essentially means your ads are stitched into the content stream. But the additional nuance we deal with is that you have all these different entities that don't necessarily play nice and pass information back to each other. So you may have one entity that holds the ad itself, and then you have another entity that is kind of like a CMS, essentially holding the podcast stream. You may have another entity that stitches the two together. So the podcast stream at the end, last minute, essentially at the last moment, will say, this is the ad that I need you to stitch into the stream, pulls it in, stitches it in, and pushes it to yet another entity, which is where we as consumers listen to our podcasts. So while we may be able to get certain level of information from here, which is essentially, was the ad delivered, those listener metrics have to come from the client-side app itself, which is where we are listening to the audio stream for podcasting. So was the sound on? Did we listen all the way through? Did we listen to the ad and then skip through it, mute it? All of these different indicators that provide better information around listening behavior. Another nuance that we have to take into account as well for podcasting, which makes it a little bit of a longer journey for us to get to that level of scale from a measurement standpoint, is things like listener behavior for podcasts. Some people will listen to podcasts at 2x, 1.5x. Oftentimes when learning a new language, you may listen to your podcast at 0.5x in that language that you're looking to learn, which is actually a really good strategy. But what does that essentially mean for how those ads are measured, how we think about the ad length itself? So those are different questions that we're definitely looking to answer with our partners that we're already collaborating with. So ultimately, what does this mean? Within music streaming, you do have these two different ad delivery mechanisms. And from a measurement standpoint, the open measurement SDK seems to be the most scalable method for getting third-party verification and measurement across the audio ad experience. So a very strong indicator of how seriously audio is becoming a major part of these media buys. The latest version of OM SDK, which is OMID 1.3, actually includes support for audio ads. So as long as that's integrated within the app, you have the opportunity to get all of that level of measurement that we spoke earlier, answering those questions for those brands, such as, was my ad delivered? Was it delivered to a human endpoint? Did it read the first, second, third quartile? Was the sound on? And so on. Now, the beauty of that as well is that earlier this year, OM actually released OM for web, which ultimately means that you have that same level of measurement across desktop and mobile app and mobile web as well. So you're really starting to expand the scope of where you can better understand what's going on with your audio inventory. So there's a few different ways to do this. Again, this doesn't necessarily capture the entire scope, but what I do want to highlight is that there are VAST tags that can be used. There will be differences between client-side ad insertion and server-side ad insertion. Certain aspects will require developer work, but that's across the board for all industries and for all different players within the audio ecosystem, not necessarily industries, but we essentially figure that out together as a collaborative effort together. So the server-to-server integration is another method of doing this. This is essentially when the code lives on the player. And this is similar to some of what the walled gardens essentially use. You also have the audio one by one, which is a method that can give you just things like, was the podcast or music stream downloaded, and was it delivered to a human endpoint? There are nuances in programmatic as well, just giving how that level of measurement has to scale out requires each of those players to be able to provide that level of sophisticated measurement back to the programmatic player as well. When we go into podcasts, as we mentioned, because of all of those different nuances, you do have a slightly more restricted set of metrics today, which would give you things like, was my podcast downloaded? And the podcast stream essentially having the ad already stitched in, from where you can make a directional, you can directionally derive from that, yes, my ad may have been heard. And then of course, from a longer term strategy, those direct integrations with those audio listening platforms, those podcast listening platforms will ultimately provide all of those additional metrics around listener behavior. Now, the last challenge that we are jumping into is audience targeting concerns. And this has more to do with just the future state of where we're headed. So while right now, there are some pretty great sophisticated ways to use ID graphs and use your own reg-based data from an audio platform perspective and tie that into all of these third-party data and third-party data methods as well, you have these great ways that you can go well beyond just the simple demo and geo ways of getting to your audiences where they are. It helps provide a much more effective experience as well. But one thing to keep in mind, just given the constantly changing nature of our industry, and especially when you think of things like a cookieless future or Apple's privacy relay, one of the things to keep into consideration is that contextual intelligence, better understanding the context of your audio and your podcast, is essentially a very powerful mix that should be added into the consideration when doing audience targeting as well. So I'm going to dive into that just a little bit to better understand essentially what we're aiming towards. And contextual intelligence, one of the key things in this is how you use your methodology and how you take into consideration the languages that are spoken all around the world. So from a methodology standpoint, it's incredibly important to be transparent and accurate in how you are using your methodology to classify different kinds of content into different categories, because again, that ultimately helps sustain the ecosystem of storytelling and journalism as you unlock additional inventory that may not have existed before. So to go a little bit, or you may not have known existed before. So to go a little bit deeper into that, the methodology, it's really important for it to not be a one-to-one match, where if the word knife shows up on a page, it's automatically classified as violent content, whereas what we're really looking at in that transcription is someone talking about a knife in the context of a recipe. So looking at all the other keywords that exist, starting to think about different algorithms that go into the frequency of those keywords, how many times it's showing up, what are the keywords that are alongside that specific word. All of those different things can go into better understanding context itself. Now, one of the things that we pride ourselves at Oracle Advertising too, is the ability to do the same thing for audio transcripts that are in 20 plus different languages. And one of the cool things about that is working with local linguistic teams to better understand cultural context. And an example is when you think about regional differences of how the word alcohol can be treated. In certain regions of the world, it could be treated as taboo and it's prohibited in certain regions of the world, whereas in other regions of the world, it's considered more so of a celebratory drink where everyone is coming together and it's more of a festivity. So those kinds of considerations are also incredibly important from a brand safety perspective, where we don't just classify things as one and ultimately, again, end up hurting the content creator itself. Now, what's really neat about contextual intelligence is the ability to unlock inventory and unlock content that you may not have known existed in that level. So an example we like to use is if you're thinking about an airline, you can not only let them know that, hey, we can make sure your ads don't serve around content that has to do with a drunk pilot or lost baggage or delayed flights or whatever it may be. But essentially now you have the opportunity to serve your ads to audiences, not only who are listening to podcasts within the travel category, but maybe even the tech category, talking about, for an episode that may be talking about your favorite travel gadgets to take with you on vacation. So that's ultimately a really big part of discoverability as well. And having that strong methodology to back that up will allow for that to happen in a much more thoughtful and mindful way as we move towards it. A few considerations to keep into account for audio as well are things like tone of voice. How do you really capture sarcasm when you're taking these audio files and transcribing them into text? Thinking about deeper sentiment as well, that when it goes beyond just a high level of understanding context. So all of these things are things we've been taking into consideration when we are building out our solutions at Oracle Advertising. But what's important here to note is that it will consistently be a collaborative effort with all the different players within the audio ecosystem to better understand ultimately how we can expand the scope of what we can do within digital audio, while again being mindful to protect the medium from having a poor consumer experience, and also make sure that we're sustaining mindfully the ecosystem of audio journalism and creative process in the form of music. So now I'm very excited to pass this over to my colleague, Mark Rogers, who will be in conversation with Faye McDowall. But before we jump into that, I'm actually going to pass this over to Faye, who's going to give a little bit more context around Global DAX and what they do and how they're a major player in the ecosystem. Faye, all yours.
Thanks, Moomal. So just to give you a bit of context, I just thought I'd explain a bit more about Global and our digital audio product DAX before we go into conversation with Mark. So Global is well known in the UK as a radio and entertainment business. We have some of the largest broadcast radio stations in the UK, from Heart to Capital to Classic and Radio X and Smooth. More recently, we bought 3 outdoor companies. So Global Outdoor is now one of the largest outdoor companies in Europe. And then more specifically for this event, which is relevant, we have our digital audio ad product, which is called DAX. So combined, we have a weekly reach of 52 million in the UK. If you could click on the next slide. So we launched DAX, for those of you unfamiliar with it, in 2014. And this was really at the start of, it was a nascent market in digital audio. We saw that there were lots of different platforms and players popping up, but there was no real way for advertisers to access this market in one easy buy. It was quite a complicated, busy place. And if you wanted to reach any type of scale, it would mean talking to hundreds of different digital audio platforms. So what we did was we basically brought together in the UK 180 different music streaming, podcasts and radio, connected radio platforms to allow advertisers to access them in, as I say, in one simple buy. If you could click to the next slide. So fast forward now in 2021, and we have about 180 of the best audio businesses in the world across the UK, the US and Canada, with a total reach of 146 million. And a huge part of our inventory is, of course, podcasts. So that's why we were very excited to work with Oracle on the contextual targeting product, because it really unlocked some interesting opportunities for us. Mark.
Cool. Thank you so much, Faye, and thank you for coming along today. So given the footprint of IAB Europe's users, and given that you've got this UK and North America focus, I guess the thing that might be useful for everybody is kind of to understand, as a case study, if you like, how you found working with us, and really to kick all that off, what was the problem you were hoping to solve, or what's the main problem for people like Global DAX in this market?
So for DAX, really, it's a nice problem to have. As Moomal hinted, like, podcast growth has been huge. So in the UK specifically, there's been a 43% increase in ad revenue in the last year. You've got just under 17 million people listening to podcasts each week. A third of them are listening to up to 10 episodes a week. So it's an amazing audience, and it's a hugely engaged audience for advertisers to tap into. The challenge we had was that the tech was slightly lagging behind. So up until recently, up until working with Oracle, we were quite limited in terms of the audience data that was available. So from a targeting perspective, it was really constrained to the traditional iTunes verticals, which can be fairly blunt in their approach to categorizing the content. And it didn't really unearth any of the great richness of the brilliance of podcasts. So we thought this was just a really clever solution for us, because regardless of whatever changing EU regulations or Google or tech guidelines come into play, this allows us a really clever solution to expanding our targeting capabilities in podcasts.
And just talk me through that a little bit of detail. So how does, well, what are you actually doing? I should really ask, because people might have a sort of vague idea, but it'd be great if you could just, give some examples.
So I think a really good example is if you take all of the hundreds of podcasts that we have available for advertisers to place their spot ads in. At the moment, advertisers could just target by, for example, the comedy vertical in iTunes. Using this tool, what we're able to do is to give advertisers the opportunity to target podcasts based on the conversations that are happening in the podcast. And if you look at the top 10 podcasts across any country, most of them are two people having a really interesting conversation. So the great thing about this is it plays to the benefit of podcasts. So, for example, if you take something like sports, so we have many great sports podcasts within our inventory. But actually, if you delve deeper into sports, there's a lot of conversations in sports podcasts around business, because of the great, football is a big business, is driven by money. So there's an awful lot of conversations around tournaments, transfers, how well clubs are performing, which really appeals to a business audience. Equally, when there's a big tournament on in another country, a lot of the conversations become around travel. They become around the culture of that country and the different nuances, the experience, the weather. So all those different conversations allow us to hugely expand not only the opportunity for advertisers to have a greater, more diverse reach and to be in relevant conversations, but also for our podcast publishers to be able to expand their opportunity to grow their revenue.
And how do you discover those contexts that you wouldn't otherwise see from categorizations at the iTunes level?
So that comes from the Oracle tool. So it allows us, it goes through our podcast episodes as they're released, and then categorizes and segments them into those kind of what we're calling conversational segments that are relevant. So, for example, if we had a parenting podcast that was that was an episode that was released, the Oracle tool will scan that podcast episode and allow us to identify whether there's a conversation about ferrying the kids to and from school and therefore around cars, or if there's a conversation about trying to get your toddler to eat peas, for example, or what food to feed them, and that's how we're using it.
So you've now, I think we've been working together, and just for the basis of the background to this, we've been I think we've been working with you for 9 months or more, a little bit more now on this. What have been surprises that you've discovered in this time from these kinds of running these kinds of analysis on the podcasts that you're seeing?
That's an interesting question. I think probably the breadth of different conversations and cross-pollination that's available. So we're able to, an example would be recently a campaign we ran for an electrical retailer who had a new product range which was all around green, go greener, so greener fridges, greener ovens, greener washing machines that are more sustainable. And they really wanted to advertise in content all about the environment. And what was really useful for us is that we were able to use this tool to show them that actually the reach that they could achieve by being in more contextually relevant conversations would be greater. And I think that's the really great thing, is just, so for example, for this retailer, we advise them to be in conversations in and around the home, to be in conversations around family, to be in conversations around technology and environment too, but just to think about expanding the remit, because that's what, when it starts to become surprising, because you're able to show them that they can reach the right context and therefore the right audience in a place that they just wouldn't have expected.
Very interesting. And so I imagine from looking at some of the attendees on this list, there will be people who are at different stages of their evolution in terms of how they've applied technology to podcast advertising. What do you think are the kind of, your priorities, or how have you at DAX approached this, in order of priorities? What's been your strategy there?
So I think first and foremost, we wanted to look at how we could unlock inventory that was less demanded, because it was perceived to kind of sit in one box rather than having a kind of a broader appeal. The second thing I think was just incredibly inquisitive about what our inventory looked like and where we might see growing opportunities. So what it does is gives us a better understanding of the type of content that's sitting within our portfolio, which helps us then understand a better way of using that to meet advertiser needs. So I think the other thing is it's really important to be flexible and take a collaborative approach. So some examples kind of talked about earlier were the understanding the nuance of the content that's being talked about. So within our remit, because we have so many radio stations, because we have an entertainment business, we have a lot of entertainment type content. And so sometimes certain phrases in the entertainment context might be identified as potentially challenging from a brand safety point of view, but they're actually in the context of environment that it's a book or a film or a TV show that they're referring to. So it's not challenging. And I think working with you guys to be really flexible and adaptable to find those nuances and how we can adapt what we're doing has been really important.
And talking about brand suitability and brand safety, I mean, just from looking at the kinds of categorizations that come out from podcasts, it feels like the number one thing that is ever flagged as unsafe is curse words. That there's quite a lot of informal language and there's quite a lot of swearing. And obviously, if it was in print, that might be quite offensive. And how do you talk to advertisers and sort of play around that nuance of what's acceptable in terms of kind of bad language or words that are sort of might be spoken, but the context is slightly different when they're written down?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is about taking a nuanced approach to it. So for example, what I often say is when a podcast is being listened to, it's the people listening to it you don't listen to a podcast by accident. Nobody stumbles on a podcast. You choose to listen to a podcast because you're engaged with the subject matter, the host, or one of the guests that they have. And so if they are to use a curse word within that environment, often it's not, it doesn't come across as unsavory as it might do were you to stumble across an article or a video that had a lot of those types of words in it and references because you weren't expecting it. And I think that is just understanding kind of the scale as well of the words too. So, you know, for example, there are kind of scaled severity of some of those naughty words, and being able to monitor that is really helpful as well.
So what I'm hearing is that there are benefits on the publisher side, and obviously you're a publisher yourself, but you also, as I understand it, aggregate other publishers from monetizing things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to monetize. And then there are also benefits in, if you like, managing the sort of suitability, the kind of brand suitability. What are the other benefits that you see from using contextual intelligence to help targeting?
Well, I think, you know, as I said, really, you kind of nailed the core benefits for us, and I think really it's being able, like I said before, it's kind of about being able to unearth the areas that we wouldn't have expected, you know, where we're seeing a growth in content. You know, we can understand much more about kind of the trends which are happening in podcasts. So if we're seeing that there's, for example, I mean, this is an obvious example, but during the pandemic, we would see a growth in podcasts talking about public health issues, or, you know, if there's a launch of a new film which perhaps captures the public consciousness and gets everyone excited, you might start to see that generate more content on a certain subject matter, or something in the news can then spawn kind of more of a public movement. And again, we see that growth. So it allows us to kind of start to preempt the types of content that might become popular.
And in terms of your objectives for the next 12 months, given where you are in your evolution, where are you concentrating in terms of where you're thinking about the market and how you're going to develop it?
Really for us, it's to continue to get to a point where advertisers see using contextual targeting podcasts as the kind of the way that they buy their podcast spot. So allowing them to be really clever about where their ads are appearing, and feel confident in that space. And I think if we could get to a point where that is the way that it's bought, then we'll be in a really good, interesting space.
Cool, thank you very much. So Lauren, I know there were a couple of questions that came in. If you are happy to kind of pick up and, you know, farm those out, and if anybody has any questions from what we've just been discussing, maybe they could chat those or add them to the list.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one that came through actually, I think, was based on Moomal's presentation. So Moomal, it was questioning, how do you choose the measurement method you use when looking at audio?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So I think that question is from Federica. So I believe that has to do with the slide that we were discussing around client-side ad insertion and server-side ad insertion. So it really depends on the ad delivery method. So ultimately what that means is we sit down with our audio platform partner and scope it out, better understand how are your ads served today within your audio platforms and your audio inventory, and what options you have, whether you go the OM SDK route, the server-to-server route, or the audio one-by-one. Aside from just the technical setup, it's also about your business decision. There's a few different factors that go into it, but that's a high-level answer, but it has to be scoped out is ultimately what it comes down to.
Brilliant, thanks, Moomal. And then we had a couple of questions that came through from Albert, and I think these might both be related to Faye, but correct me if I'm wrong. So the last one that just came through is, it sounds like the music and podcasting growth you covered applies specifically to on-demand content. How about the traditional live radio streamed over the internet? Do you have any research on that, or is it no longer relevant?
I think, yeah, it's probably a combination of me and Moomal that answer this, because certainly from a global point of view, a huge part of our inventory is based on radio live streaming. So that's very much a part of our inventory and will continue to be the foundation of our product in the UK. So yes, that's absolutely. In terms of research, I guess is the question in terms of audience scale or behaviours. We're certainly seeing that audiences are continuing to turn to the kind of convenience of streaming live radio, either as Moomal was saying, when they're on the go doing other activities or want to kind of break from the screen, but also more simply just as a way of listening or catching up with their favourite radio station or favourite radio show.
Great. Moomal, did you want to add anything there? Or
I think I would agree with literally everything Faye just said, and just add to that I think the more that we have investment into the space, and it's certainly coming as you read through press releases constantly, there will be more technology available to do deeper research. So whatever may not be available today, I think over time, folks like Global will help us uncover all of these better insights around user behavior in these different music streaming and audio streaming environments.
Brilliant, thank you. And then the other question that came through from Albert was, do you think you may release some kind of transcription API so developers can benefit from your systems having to do speech to text processing for contextual analysis anyway?
That's probably one for me, I guess. Yeah, it has been. It's something that we've been discussing, honestly, and to be honest, we're sort of gauging how it would work and how delivered at the moment. Most transcription that's done, ours is very accurate, but it's not good enough on its own that you would post it straight to a web page. You need to do some manual curation. Things like proper names can get slightly garbled because the speech to text is based on essentially a dictionary. Foreign words, for example, and names tend to need to be corrected. So you could certainly help, and part of this. This is possibly something that you should ping me about offline, Albert. But part of this is actually gauging the, whether people want this service, whether it's actually part of what we offer, or maybe it's something that a CMS offers, because obviously we're not a CMS, but our integrations with folks like Global DAX and so on have a sort of element of that about them. So part of this is figuring out kind of, who sells this service to whom, frankly, or is it part of a bundled offer? And how does all that work? But yeah, it's definitely something that could and probably should happen. It's just a question of figuring out, honestly, the business case for it, so everybody's happy and it can get rolled out in the market.
Brilliant, thank you. We've had a couple more comments, so we'll try and squeeze a couple more audience questions in before we round up. How do we standardise the contextual categorisation of podcasts across the different suppliers?
Well, so the standardization is historically we were a business called Grapeshot, who some of your listeners, some of the people on the webinar today, Radio Talk there. Some people might be familiar with, now part of Oracle Contextual Intelligence. And we have our own standard categorization. We're transitioning in the coming year to an IAB-based categorization. So those are categorizations that you can kind of look up. They're sort of standard categorization. So you have, sport, ice hockey, sport, American football, and so on. It's fairly standardized. And then there is the capability, which will become more of a thing as the business evolves, to do custom targeting, so that as an advertiser, you can set up your own targeting and you can put in your own terms. So if you want to target veganism, you can put in relevant terms around veganism, which might be too small to have its own syndicated category, and you can target that kind of content. That's really moving towards the world that we're anticipating coming, I think probably in the coming year or so, where we're moving to a system of real-time bidding. And we're not quite there yet, but when we get to real-time bidding and we have persistent IDs for each of the podcasts that we categorize, that we can recognize when they're in the bid stream, we can then offer those kinds of partnering with DAX and folk like that, we can offer that kind of contextual custom targeting as well.
Brilliant. It's certainly an exciting time, isn't it, for all this to be happening?
Yeah. I mean, it's all being invented at the moment.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
it's all from Albert
exciting to see.
Ideas.
And Lauren, if I could add to that as well,
yeah, of course.
I think one of the things as well for our industry overall is to ask those difficult questions sometimes. So what is that standardization? What goes into different categorization, whether it's from a contextual intelligence of positively targeting or negatively targeting. And even from a brand perspective, those two things could mean something totally different. So as Mark mentioned, one brand may want to target veganism. That's most certainly not going to be a brand that is selling meat products. So it's really important on the flip side as well to not just have a blanket approach towards brand safety. I think a few years ago, Levi's or Diesel jeans brand, denim brand took this very different approach to what they think of as brand safety versus something like P&G or Unilever. So asking those questions, I think, is an integral part of how we get to that end goal for our advertiser partners as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. Asking those kind of questions is always key to kind of developing these in these emerging sort of formats. So yeah, keep asking those questions and also look, to people like IAB. We've got our buyer's guide to digital audio, which our members obviously helped, including Oracle Advertising, to create. So we've got those kind of educational pieces there as well, if you need sort of help and guidance on what the kind of right questions to ask are as well. I'll just do one more question and then we can wrap up for the afternoon. So we've got one here around KPIs. So what kind of KPIs are clients mostly looking for when looking at contextual and measurement solutions with you guys?
I can start that one off, and I'd love to hear from Faye and Mark on this one too. So I think it's still evolving right now. Historically, from a measurement perspective, for example, there has not been very sophisticated measurement. So you haven't really had any kind of transparency into the audio ad experience up until Moat was actually being first to market, started 2 years ago. So prior to that, you had things like, was an impression pixel or a viewability pixel fired on the companion banner running alongside an audio ad, or you're looking just at downloads. So I think right now it's just getting transparency to know, was my ad served? Was it served to a human endpoint? And then some folks are going beyond that to look at things like the MRC audible rate. They're going beyond that to start to think about the different quartiles that we mentioned earlier. So I know that's a broad answer, but it really varies because transparency into that experience has only recently been offered. From a contextual standpoint, I'll make a quick comment and pass it over to Mark and Faye. I think it's more so, how can we unlock additional inventory so there's greater discoverability for the inventory that's available? Whereas, of course, there's always that buzzword of brand safety, and that goes back to the importance of methodology and asking those questions that we mentioned earlier. Mark, would you like to add from a context?
Yeah, I was actually going to throw it over to Faye, because all of my KPIs are around kind of internal accuracy statistics and measure, and how good we are at accurately measuring things internally. But Faye, I guess it's on the business side for you. What kinds of stats do you monitor?
Yeah, so from a measurement point of view, we actually, there are kind of key indicators that we get asked using our listener ID product. So that's where we're looking at things like engagement of the listener on the site that they've gone to visit, listen through rate. Listen through rate's also a really strong indicator for podcasts. And if you think about listen through rate, when an ad is in a contextually relevant environment, then that becomes even more interesting for us to look at. The other elements that we've been looking at is if an advertiser was going to buy a vertical, so for example, if they were going to buy sport as a vertical in previously, if using the new Oracle contextual targeting tool, they're able to access podcasts and we can show them podcasts outside of that vertical, then that's a really interesting KPI for us to look at as well, because it just shows that the growth and the breadth of scale that they're able to achieve.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, thank you, Moomal, Faye and Mark, for your amazing insight over the last hour. I think we've all learned a thing or two about audio and measurement and contextual. So thank you so much for taking your time to share insights with us. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have recorded this session, so we'll be sure to share a copy of this with everyone that's joined us today. But otherwise, with that, have a great rest of your day, and we'll hope to see you soon. Enjoy the Christmas break.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.